Have you ever sat next to someone you love deeply and still felt utterly alone? Why does that happen? How can two people share the same space, yet feel worlds apart? If you've ever asked yourself, are we really meant to be together? Then you're not alone. And perhaps that question is not the end of a love story, but the beginning of a deeper truth. Welcome, dear friends, to Stillness Unfolded, a place where we explore the quiet truths of the heart, the soul, and the path of letting go with compassion. In today's video, we'll walk through 12 profound signs that you and someone you care about may not be destined to walk this life together, not out of punishment, but as part of a karmic unfolding. Each sign is rooted in Zen and Buddhist wisdom, offering clarity and insight for those moments when love feels more like resistance than refuge. So I invite you to pause, breathe, and join me fully in this journey of awareness and acceptance. And if you value deep reflections like these, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every interaction helps this community grow and allows us to keep creating meaningful content that speaks to the soul. This video is filled with gentle insights and transformative realizations, so I encourage you to watch until the very end to fully receive the message waiting for you. Sign 1. The silence feels heavy, not sacred. At the beginning of many relationships, silence can feel like a sanctuary. You sit together, no words needed, and yet it feels like the whole world is speaking in that quiet. There's peace in the pause, connection in the stillness. It feels like your souls are breathing in rhythm, as if simply being near each other is enough. But as time passes, something imperceptible may begin to shift. What once brought calm now brings restlessness. The silence that used to feel like a warm blanket suddenly feels like a cold wall. You speak, but the words seem to vanish into a void. You glance over, but their eyes are lost elsewhere. You wait, but the moment never meets you back. In Zen, true connection is not proven by how much we speak. It's revealed by how deeply we're present. And presence has nothing to do with physical closeness. It's about being seen, felt, and acknowledged in the unseen. When two people are in harmony, silence becomes a dialogue. It vibrates with presence. You feel nourished by the quiet, like drinking from still water. But when that harmony dissolves, silence becomes a burden, dense, sharp, and unsettling. It's not the absence of noise that hurts. It's the absence of recognition. Ask yourself, when I am silent next to them, do I feel understood? Or do I feel invisible? Because if your silence begins to feel like isolation, if it leaves your heart with questions rather than comfort, this is not merely emotional distance. It's a deeper sign, a sign that the spiritual resonance between you may have begun to fade. And the tragedy is not in the lack of conversation, but in the silence that no longer holds love. Sign 2. Familiarity reveals, not deepens. In the beginning, connection often feels effortless. Chemistry dances between glances. Every conversation feels like discovery. You laugh more. Time slips by. Their presence feels like destiny dressed in skin. But that first spark is not proof of permanence. It is merely the invitation. And like all invitations, it must lead somewhere deeper or fade. Zen teaches that time is the great revealer. It strips away illusion not to hurt us, but to show us what truly is. When the passion settles and the novelty wears thin, what remains is the essence, their nature, your values, the real shape of your bond. And sometimes, what familiarity reveals is not deeper unity, but quiet misalignment. You start to notice things. The conversations become loops, not revelations. The same arguments return like uninvited guests. What once felt like compromise now feels like self-erasure. There is a difference between adjusting and abandoning yourself. Love asks for patience, not sacrifice of soul. When you feel like you must contort your truth to maintain closeness, you're not growing, you're shrinking. In Buddhism, right relationship is one where both beings can unfold into more of who they are, not less. But in misaligned unions, effort turns transactional. You give hoping to get. You adapt only to be misunderstood. You mold yourself to be accepted and still feel unseen. The joy of being known begins to erode. If the rhythm of your connection now feels like walking on uneven ground, each step cautious, uncertain, that is not the nature of true companionship. That is spiritual friction. Ask yourself, Am I becoming more of myself in this relationship, or am I slowly disappearing within it? Because when time no longer deepens love, but exposes cracks hidden beneath the surface, the lesson is not to patch them. It is to understand what they are revealing. Not all that begins beautifully is meant to bloom forever. Sign 3. Their presence weighs more than their absence. Love, when pure, feels light. Not because it's perfect, but because it doesn't ask you to carry more than your soul can hold. But what happens when being near someone feels heavier than walking alone? There comes a moment, subtle yet undeniable, when their presence no longer soothes you, but unsettles you. You may not realize it at first. It starts with a sigh you didn't know you were holding, a tension in your shoulders when they enter the room, a sense of relief when they leave, not because you want them gone, but because your nervous system can finally breathe. In Buddhist psychology, this is the body's wisdom speaking before the mind catches up. You laugh more in solitude. You rest deeper without needing to explain yourself. You find joy in your own company, not because you've stopped loving them, but because their presence no longer nurtures your peace. This is not selfish. This is awareness. When your spirit begins to relax in their absence, that is not a betrayal of love. It's the revelation of truth. The soul knows before the ego accepts. It recognizes energy, even when the mind is still clinging to memory. Zen teaches that true presence is not about who is near you, but who helps you feel more fully yourself. If their presence brings confusion more often than clarity, if you feel like you're constantly bracing yourself for the next misunderstanding, the next dismissal, the next emotional void, then perhaps their absence is not the loss you fear, but the freedom you need. Ask yourself, do I feel more myself when I'm away from them? If the answer is yes, that isn't a failure. That's your spirit remembering how light it used to be before it had to carry the weight of forced belonging. And sometimes, the heaviest burden is pretending that everything is still okay. Sign 4. Your inner voice no longer whispers, it roars. At first, it comes like a whisper, a quiet unease, a subtle knowing. A moment during a conversation where something doesn't sit right, but you dismiss it. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe it's just a bad day. But that whisper doesn't go away. It waits. It watches. And then, it begins to rise. Each time you compromise too much, each time you silence yourself to keep the peace, each time you pretend you're not hurting when you are, what begins as a nudge soon becomes a roar in the heart. Zen teaches us that awareness is always present. It does not fade, only gets buried beneath distraction. And when we resist it long enough, it doesn't retreat. It insists. Your inner voice begins to speak more clearly than ever. It doesn't offer solutions, it offers truth. I'm tired of pretending. I don't feel seen. This connection is costing me my peace. And the most painful part? That voice has always known. Even in the beginning, when everything sparkled, it gently questioned. But back then, you called it fear. Now, you realize it was clarity in disguise. In Buddhism, this voice is not ego. It is prajna, intuitive wisdom. It's the sacred compass that knows when something no longer aligns with your soul's journey. But when we ignore it, we betray ourselves before anyone else does. So the question isn't whether the voice is real. The question is, why are you afraid to listen? Maybe because listening means change, letting go, starting over. But clinging to comfort at the cost of truth is the surest path to suffering. And so, if your inner knowing has stopped asking and started declaring, then the time has come, not to run, but to return. To yourself, to what you've always known beneath the noise. Because the longer you ignore the voice within, the louder the world outside must become to wake you up. Sign 5. The emotional dance has become one-sided. Love is a dance, not always synchronized, not always graceful, but one in which both hearts are still moving toward each other. In the early days, it may have felt effortless. You opened up, and they met you there. You shared your wounds, and they held them gently. There was space for your storms, and shelter in their arms. But now it feels different. You reach, but there's no reaching back. You speak, but the words fall flat. You give, but your offering goes unnoticed. Suddenly, you're the only one showing up to the dance floor. The music still plays, but you're dancing alone. In Buddhism, emotional reciprocity is not measured by grand gestures, but by subtle attentiveness. Not in how much someone gives, but in whether they are still present with you, heart open, soul engaged. And when one person begins to retreat, not physically, but emotionally, a sacred thread begins to fray. Maybe they stopped asking about your inner world. Maybe they no longer show curiosity in your joys or sorrows. Maybe their responses feel hollow, like they're reciting lines from a role they no longer want to play. At first, you compensate. You try harder. You make excuses. You tell yourself they're stressed, distracted, tired. But deep down, you feel the shift. What once was shared has become lopsided. You are now the giver, the fixer, the holder of the weight. And they've quietly stepped back, not with malice, but with detachment. Zen reminds us, when one waters the garden alone, the garden begins to reflect that loneliness. The bloom fades, not from neglect, but from imbalance. Ask yourself, am I still dancing with them, or with the memory of who they used to be? Because no matter how graceful you move, you cannot sustain a dance choreographed for two on your own. And sometimes, love doesn't end in heartbreak. It ends in silence, when one person quietly stops showing up. Sign 6. You find peace in letting go, not holding on. Letting go is often misunderstood. We imagine it as a dramatic ending, a slammed door, a tearful goodbye, a breaking point loud enough to echo. But the truth is, some of the deepest releases arrive without sound. They come in the form of a calm breath, a morning that feels lighter, a thought of them that no longer stings. One day, you look at the relationship, not in anger, not in desperation, but in quiet honesty. And you know it's over. Not because something broke, but because something inside you healed. Zen teaches that peace is not what we find after the chaos. Peace is what was waiting for us all along, beneath the clinging. Clinging makes us believe we must fight harder, that we must hold on, prove ourselves, fix everything. But real love, the kind that nourishes the soul, doesn't demand we lose ourselves in the process of keeping it. And so, when the need to hold on begins to dissolve, when your heart no longer begs for one more chance, but instead whispers, I'm ready to rest, that's not failure. That's freedom. You stop rehearsing what to say. You stop checking your phone for their name. You stop building castles in your mind for someone who only ever stood at the gate. And in that space, where clinging ends and clarity begins, you find a kind of peace that doesn't ask questions. It simply is. Buddhism reminds us, you only lose what you cling to. But when you stop clinging, you realize you've lost nothing. In fact, you've gained yourself. So if you find yourself breathing easier at the thought of letting go, don't fight that peace. Trust it. It's the truest sign that the path ahead no longer requires their footsteps beside yours. Let go, not because love wasn't real, but because your soul is ready for something deeper, wholeness. Sign 7. The silence between you becomes a barrier, not a bridge. In true companionship, silence is not empty, it's full. It's the space between words where understanding breathes. The shared pause where two spirits rest together without performance, without pressure. A stillness that speaks without speaking. But when a relationship begins to fracture, that same silence becomes something else. It becomes thick, heavy. It no longer holds you, it divides you. You sit next to them, but it feels like a canyon stretches between you. You reach for words, but hold them back, not because there's nothing to say, but because you no longer believe it will be received. This is no longer the silence of harmony. It is the silence of survival. In Zen, we're taught that silence is one of the purest expressions of presence. When two people are in alignment, even stillness becomes sacred. There is no need to fill the space, because the space itself feels alive. But when hearts drift apart, silence becomes a mirror reflecting what is no longer spoken aloud. Resentment, distance, fear. It is no longer peaceful, it is pressurized. Every pause is laced with what remains unresolved. And sometimes, we choose that silence, because it feels safer than another argument, easier than another misunderstanding. But with each unspoken truth, a piece of intimacy fades. Ask yourself, can I sit in silence with them and feel close? Or does the silence feel louder than words ever could? If the quiet between you trembles with tension rather than trust, it's no longer a resting place, it's a wall. And relationships built on emotional walls cannot sustain spiritual depth. The absence of fighting doesn't mean there's peace. Sometimes, it means you've both stopped trying. And when silence no longer binds but breaks, that is not stillness. It is surrender to disconnection. Sign 8. Love begins to feel like labor. Love, at its essence, is not supposed to drain you. Yes, it asks for effort. Yes, it requires patience, grace, and growth. But it should not feel like emotional exhaustion. It should not feel like you're clocking into a job where your soul keeps working overtime, without rest, without recognition. There's a difference between working through challenges and constantly working for love. In the beginning, perhaps the effort felt purposeful. You wanted to understand them. You showed up willingly, with softness and presence. But over time, something shifted. Now your giving feels strained. Your care feels unnoticed. Your devotion feels expected. And expectations, when unmet, breed quiet resentment. Buddhism teaches us about right effort, a principle of the Eightfold Path. It is not about relentless striving. It is about intentional, compassionate energy that brings peace rather than perpetuates suffering. But when you find yourself tiptoeing, overthinking every word, trying to earn their affection or avoid their withdrawal, the effort is no longer right. It has become rooted in fear, in scarcity, in self-abandonment. You start changing not to grow, but to please. You silence parts of yourself just to keep the peace. You perform connection instead of living in it. And all the while, something inside you begins to fade. Love that requires you to become smaller in order to survive is not love. It is dependency in disguise. Ask yourself, is the work I'm doing in this relationship making me more alive or more exhausted? Because the labor of love is meant to build, not bury you. To elevate, not erode. And when the cost of connection is your emotional vitality, that's not a partnership. That's a slow disconnection dressed in duty. Sign 9. Loneliness grows in their presence. There is a kind of loneliness that silence cannot heal. It does not come from being physically alone. It arises when you are surrounded, but unseen. Touched, but untouched. Heard, but never truly felt. This is the loneliness that blooms beside someone who once held your heart. At first, it's subtle. You brush it off as stress, as a rough patch. You convince yourself that all relationships go through moments like this. But slowly, steadily, the ache deepens. You realize you laugh more when they're not around. You feel more yourself when you're with others, or alone. Your thoughts no longer reach for them first, but return to you, seeking refuge. In Buddhism, true connection is not measured by physical closeness, but by energetic presence. We are not nourished by another's body. We are nourished by their awareness, their sincerity, their presence. And when that presence fades, even shared space becomes a desert. You might be sitting at the same table, eating the same meal, sharing the same roof, but internally, you are galaxies apart. They don't ask about the parts of you that are aching. They don't notice when you shrink. And over time, you stop offering those parts, not out of bitterness, but from a quiet surrender. Zen teaches, solitude is not the enemy. False togetherness is. Ask yourself, do I feel lonelier beside them than I do in my own company? If the answer is yes, then your spirit already knows what your mind is afraid to admit. Presence without intimacy is more isolating than absence ever could be. Because when someone stops meeting you in the spaces that matter, they don't just leave the room, they leave the relationship. And the most sacred form of loneliness is realizing you're already alone, long before anyone says goodbye. Sign 10. Your inner wisdom stops asking and starts telling. In the early stages of confusion, your inner voice speaks softly. It asks questions gently, hoping you'll listen. Why do I feel so tired? Is this what love is supposed to feel like? Why does something feel off? But when those questions go unanswered, or worse, are ignored, it stops asking. It starts telling. Not with judgment, not with panic, but with certainty. A steady truth that rises from the depth of your being. You can feel it in your breath, in your chest, in the subtle heaviness that follows you throughout the day. This isn't right. You're not being met. You've stayed too long. In Zen, the inner voice is not mystical. It is awareness, refined through presence. It is the wisdom of your lived experience distilled into truth. And it grows louder the more you try to silence it with logic, attachment, or hope. You may distract yourself with busyness. You may rationalize their behavior. You may cling to what you thought this relationship could become. But that voice that remains, it doesn't waver like feelings do. It doesn't shift with moods or memories. It simply waits for you to have the courage to hear it fully. Buddhism teaches that suffering often comes not from what we know, but from what we refuse to accept. Ask yourself, am I afraid of what my soul already knows? Because if your inner wisdom has stopped negotiating and started declaring, then you're no longer confused. You're just resisting clarity. And the longer you postpone listening, the more pain accumulates, not because the voice is wrong, but because you've been trying to live in opposition to it. Trust it, not because it's easy, but because it's honest. And honesty, even when it breaks something, will always build something more real. Sign 11. You're the only one still tending the garden. Love is a shared cultivation. It's like a garden. Sometimes you plant, sometimes they water. Sometimes you prune, sometimes they protect. Not always equal in action, but always mutual in care. But what happens when you're the only one still showing up with your hands in the soil? You bring presence, they bring absence. You offer softness, they respond with silence. You initiate connection, and it fades into indifference. At first, you tell yourself they're tired, overwhelmed, distracted. You justify their absence by becoming more present. You overextend, overgive, overcompensate, until one day, you realize you're no longer in a partnership. You're in a performance. In Buddhism, love is not defined by grand gestures. It is measured in the quiet tending of the heart, not in perfection, but in participation. And when that participation vanishes, the relationship slowly erodes, not with a crash, but with a quiet decay. Like a garden untended, not destroyed, just forgotten. You begin to feel like a caretaker instead of a companion, a giver without a receiver, a soul reaching across empty space, hoping to touch something that no longer reaches back. Zen asks us to observe with stillness, not react with desperation. So pause and ask yourself, am I watering this garden alone? Because if you are, it's not disloyalty to stop. It's self-respect. Love is not a place where only one heart is asked to bloom. When care becomes one-sided, what you have is not a bond, it's a burden. And holding on to something that no longer holds you is not loyalty. It's the slow denial of your own need to be nourished. Let the truth settle. If they stop tending the garden, the season has changed. And it's okay to walk away when you're the only one still trying to grow something real. Sign 12. Peace has replaced the panic. You know it's truly over, not when your heart breaks, but when it no longer does. Not when you're crying on the floor, but when you're sitting upright in silence and feel still, calm, clear. There is a moment, often unannounced, where the panic that once clung to the thought of losing them begins to dissolve. And in its place arises something unfamiliar, but welcome, peace. At first, it's disorienting. You expected grief. You anticipated sorrow. But instead, you feel relief. Not because you no longer care, but because your spirit has finally stopped resisting what it's always known. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not found through control, but through surrender. And surrender doesn't always look like defeat. It often looks like grace. You stop asking, what if? You stop waiting for a text that never comes. You stop needing closure, because your heart has already closed the chapter on its own. This peace is not apathy. It is not numbness. It is the soft, sacred clarity that comes from no longer betraying yourself for the sake of hope. You begin to smile again, not out of spite, but out of return. You find beauty in small things again, not because you're trying to forget them, but because you've remembered you. Zen reminds us, when the mind no longer seeks, the heart returns home. And this peace, this quiet certainty, is the signal that the karmic lesson is complete. The storm has passed, and now, all that remains is the clear sky of your own becoming. Ask yourself, if I let go today, does my soul feel heavier or lighter? If the answer is lighter, then you're not walking away from love. You're walking toward truth. And in that truth, there is no drama. There is only release. If these signs resonated with your heart, perhaps it's not because something is broken, but because something within you is awakening. The journey of realizing that you were not meant to be with someone is not a journey of loss. It's a journey of liberation. And in that letting go, you may just rediscover the most sacred connection of all, the one with yourself. Remember, true love does not require clinging. It invites presence. And sometimes, walking away is not the end. It's the beginning of becoming whole again. If this video helped bring clarity, I kindly ask you to leave a like, subscribe to Stillness Unfolded, and share your reflections in the comments. Your insight might be the very thing someone else needs to hear today. And if you made it this far, thank you. Your attention is sacred. May this message stay with you long after the video ends, gently guiding you home to your peace, your power, and your path. Until next time, stay mindful, stay open, and let stillness unfold.